All of you. Appreciate the opportunity, just as always, to stand before you and present a lesson from God's Word. And as always, I hope the things we say and we study this morning will be in accordance with His Word, and that will grow for having spent some time together this morning, grow as Christians. Before we get into the sermon, I want to put a few disclaimers on this sermon. Number one, I probably studied for this sermon more than I've studied for any sermon before. Don't panic. That doesn't mean that we're going to go way over and there's a tremendous amount of material. There is a lot of material, but I've actually got outlines of material that I am not going to have time to cover this morning, so I made copies of those. There's some back here. I'd encourage you to pick one of those up if you're interested in what I have to say this morning. This sermon this morning is going to be different than any sermon I think I've ever preached. There's a different format, there's a different flow, and there's going to be definitely different information. Having said that, I think everything that I say this morning is 100% in accordance with God's Word. And I'm not going to present you any controversial doctrine this morning. This morning's sermon began really when I was in college. One of the universities I attended in college was Western Kentucky University. I was, in fact, a hilltopper for a brief time in my collegiate career. There at Western Kentucky University, I made friends with one of my roommates named Eric, and me and Eric were out one night, and we met a gentleman named Barry, a young man named Barry. Barry was a practicing pagan. You could tell this by some of the symbols and things that Barry was wearing, and we started to talk to Barry. We asked Barry to have a Bible study. Barry had one very simple question for us. And it was a question that we actually had a fair amount of difficulty answering to his satisfaction. Barry simply said, "Is the Bible true?" Yes, the Bible's true, absolutely, 100%. We can look at the Bible and the Bible claims to be true. Barry said, "Well, that's not good enough. I want to know why you say the Bible's true. Of course it's going to claim to be true." So we presented a few other things. Well, if you look at the archaeological record, if you look at science, if you look at fossils, that's not good enough. Why is the Bible true? So it set me on a path to study things that, it kind of made me ask the question myself, is there any information we can find outside the Bible? Are there anything that we can look at and we can determine by looking outside the pages of the Bible that the Bible is indeed true? So this morning I want us to spend some time doing that. We're going to look mainly at the archaeological record. Now, when we look at archaeological record, what that means is simply people who go and dig in the dirt. People that dig in the dirt and they find things and they look at pottery and they look at different things and they look at where buildings used to be and they find skeletons and they find graves and they interpret that information. Some of that information is completely up for interpretation and some of it is not. What I mean by that, you can find a skeleton in the dirt and that's a skeleton. That's a grave. We know a person was buried there. Now, what an archaeologist might do is look at that skeleton and say, well, I think this person lived at this and this date, and they lived in this town, and they were perhaps married with these other people they were buried with. So there is a certain amount of interpretation that goes along with it. And I want us to bear that in mind as we go throughout this study this morning. But specifically, when we look at the Bible, when we look at archaeology, we really have to kind of limit ourselves in what we study. In other words, we have to focus down on one particular question and ask that. And this morning specifically, we're going to look at the Exodus and the history of that. When we look at the Bible is not just a book of history. Right? It's a book of commandments, it's a book of doctrine, it's a book of laws, but it's also a book of grace. And yes, it is, in fact, a book that records history quite a bit throughout its pages. Specifically, we're going to look at this historical story in the Bible. the Exodus in the history, and we're going to look at what the Bible and what archaeology can tell us about that. Why the Exodus? Well, because one reason is this man. This man is Israel Finkelstein. Israel Finkelstein is a professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University. He's a practicing member of the Jewish community. He celebrates Passover. He was raised as a Jew, and of course his name is Israel. If there was one man who you would think, one professor in archaeology, you would think, well, this man is going to believe the Exodus, and he's going to look at archaeology and he's going to say, yeah, that we see evidence for it. It would be this guy. But unfortunately, he is quoted as saying the events of the Exodus did not happen as we read them in our Bibles. This lady here is Norma Franklin. Norma Franklin is a professor of archaeology at the University of Haifa. Again, she's a practicing member of the Jewish community. If there was another professor you thought would corroborate this story from the Bible, it would be Norma Franklin. But when she looks in the dirt, she says, we see no evidence for the biblical Exodus. This man is David Wolpe. David Wolpe is a Jewish rabbi. He preaches or teaches at a large congregation. Newsweek called him one of the 10 most influential rabbis in the U.S. He's written books, he's studied this subject, and he says that the Exodus is virtually indefensible. So the Exodus is really a tough subject when we look at archaeology. It's something that some of the leaders in the field say there's just no proof, there's no evidence for. And so therefore, what does that mean? That when we look at the Bible just made it up. That's what they say. This morning, I want us to keep an open mind as we look at this and ask that question, is there any proof for the Exodus? Well, let's go back and let's look at our story. We read Exodus chapter 1. Appreciate that reading. Let's go back and let's look at the first part of this story, and that is, how did the Israelites first come to Egypt? In Genesis chapter 37, we pick up with the story of Joseph. And we remember the first part of that story, that Joseph's brothers were jealous of him, and so they threw him in a pit. Then along come these Midianite traders. These traders buy Joseph, they bring him out of that pit, and it said the Midianites then went down to Egypt and they sold Joseph to Potiphar. In Genesis chapter 45, we skip way forward. In Genesis chapter 45, here Joseph's brothers, there's a famine in the land, and Joseph's brothers come to Egypt. And when they come to Egypt, they don't find Joseph as a slave, but they find Joseph as a ruler. He's now become an official in Egypt. He's become a very important person, and he's been set over the household and over the kingdom of Pharaoh. And Joseph said to them in verse 45, or chapter 45 rather, verses 4 through 5, he says, I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold to Egypt. Now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me ahead of you to save lives. Joseph saved lives through the famine. So we see how they came to Egypt. But if we fast forward through time again, there's a period there of about 430 years or so. And after that, we see that Egypt forgets Joseph. In Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And this is when the Israelites were enslaved, and shortly after that, of course, the Exodus. Now the archaeology, mainstream archaeology, would tell us that the Pharaoh this happened under, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, was this man, Ramses II, or Ramses the Great. If you've ever studied the poem by Percy B. Shelley in English, Ozymandias, he said in that poem, this traveler comes along a statue, and he reads an inscription at the bottom of that statue that says, I am Ozymandias the Great, look on my works, ye mighty in despair. This was the Pharaoh that inspired that poem. Ramses the Great, Ramses II. Whether you know it or not, you've probably seen buildings ascribed to this Pharaoh. You've seen pictures of this building probably. This was carved back into a solid stone cliff, and there were no less than 4 statues of this exact same Pharaoh on the front of this building. Ramses the Great built things all over Egypt. He created monuments to himself, and indeed he was a mighty Pharaoh and commanded a vast empire. But what does the Bible say? What does the Bible say when we look at pharaohs? What does it tell us about the date? Well, in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 11, it says, "So the Egyptians appointed taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with hard labor. They built for Pharaoh storage cities of Pithom and Ramses." So this is really where most archaeologists get that date of the Pharaoh of the Exodus. They think it was Ramses because the Israelites built these 2 cities, which are dated to the time of Ramses. Numbers chapter 33, it once again says these are the journeys of the sons of Israel by which they came out of the land of Egypt by their armies. Under the leadership of Moses and Aaron, Moses recorded their starting places according to their journeys by command of the Lord. And these are the journeys according to their starting places. They journeyed from Ramses in the first month of the 15th day of the first month on the day of the Passover. The sons of Israel started out boldly in the sight of all the Egyptians, while the Egyptians were burying their firstborn, whom the Lord had fatally struck among them. And the Lord also executed judgments against their gods. That passage gives us a lot of information there. A few points that I want to bring out and I want us to kind of memorize and think about. Number 1, they started from Ramses. They started from this city. But it also says, it gives us a good chronology, a good date of the time that they started their journey of the Exodus. But it also says that God passed judgment or executed judgments against what? The Egyptian gods. Against the Egyptian gods. So those are the passages really that mainstream archaeology and even a lot of biblical scholars focus on and say, well, this is why we think this was in the time of Ramses. However, when we look at archaeology and we look at that section of time in Egyptian history in the time of Ramses, we don't see a record. We don't see anything pointing to the time of the Exodus. Let's go back and let's ask the question, is that really the time? In Exodus chapter 12, verses 40 through 41, it says, "Now the time that the sons of Israel had lived in Egypt up until the Exodus was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on this very day, all the multitudes of the Lord departed from the land of Exodus." So they were in Exodus from the time of Joseph to the time of the Exodus, 430 years. In 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1, it says, "Now it came to pass the 480th year, after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel in the Mount of Ziv, that is the 2nd month, that Solomon began to build the house of the Lord." This is great news because when we look at 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1, it gives us a date and a time that the children of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt, and it says that was in the 4th year of the reign of Solomon, at the time that he had finished the temple, or the time he began construction of the temple, really. We have great archaeological evidence. We have a fantastic history pointing to when Solomon completed the temple and when he began building the temple. And he completed in 968 BC. He began building it around 966 BC. So 480 years before that means that the Bible places Exodus in 1446 BC. Now, how many of us have ever heard that? How many of us have ever known that? Probably none of us. None of us, because we don't look at it. We don't look at it. We don't study that as part of our history. But indeed it is. If we're children of God, if we're Christians, it is part of our history. You see, the Exodus happened in 1446 BC, somewhere in that neighborhood, in that time frame. When we look in the dirt and we look at archaeology in that time frame versus the time frame of Ramses II, we find a drastically different story. And for the remainder of our times, that's what we're going to talk about this morning. In fact, when we look at that time frame, we can then predict or look at who we think the Pharaoh of the Exodus was. And that's Amenhotep II. According to biblical chronology and Egyptian history, what you're looking at on the screen this morning would have been the Pharaoh who said, "No, I will not let your people go." Amenhotep II was a very, very cruel Pharaoh. We know this from Egyptian history. He was so cruel, in fact, that he conquered one land, and when he conquered that land, took an entire city prisoner. And as opposed to bringing the inhabitants of that city back to Egypt, he dug 2 large trenches in the sand, had his army dig 2 large trenches in the sand, filled it with the prisoners, poured oil on top of them, and set them on fire. Does his heart match the heart of the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Years later, after the Exodus, Amenhotep would continue to rule, and he wrote a letter to one of his advisors. His advisors was in the North African region in Nubia, trying to subject people there. And Amenhotep wrote this letter to him and said, "Do not trust the Nubians, the foreigners, but be wary of their people and of their magicians." Not listen to their words and pay no heed to their message. He is an extremely paranoid Pharaoh. Also, in the last 26 years, the last half of Amenhotep II's reign, we see really nothing being built. There's nothing being built. There's very, very little records. There's almost no statues of him in the last half of his reign. He started his reign with a bang and these military campaigns, and he ended his reign with a whimper. That matched the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Amenhotep II's father would have been Tutmosis III. This would have been then what we call the Pharaoh of the oppression, the Pharaoh who oppressed the people of Israel. Tutmosis III was called by archaeologists is called the Napoleon of Egypt because he conquered so many lands. He sent his armies all over, had vast military campaigns. It greatly expanded the reach of Egypt. During the reign of Amenhotep II, that same territory would shrink dramatically because Egypt had no army at that point. That brings us to Tutmosis' stepmother, Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was actually co-regency and reigned with Tutmosis III in the first part of his rule, because Tutmosis III came to the throne when he was about 3 years old. And so obviously a person can't reign when they're 3 years old, so his stepmother stepped in. His stepmother stepped in at this point and reigned with him, Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut tried to become Pharaoh. She didn't make it. Tutmosis took over the throne. About 20 years after Tutmosis took the throne of Egypt, and well into the reign of Amenhotep II, all images of Hatshepsut it was attempted to be erased. They broke statues. They chiseled her name off of pyramids and monuments. They took her out of reliefs, chiseled her pictures off of tomb walls. They launched this drastic campaign to erase her completely from history, yet a few things survive. One of those things is her inscription, or her mortuary temple that she had commissioned in the Valley of the Kings. One of the inscriptions on that temple says, "My spirit is inclined towards foreign people." And then it goes on to say, "My heart is boundless with love." Hatshepsut was, if we look at that chronology, then Hatshepsut was probably the daughter of Pharaoh who plucked Moses or drew him out of the Nile and adopted him. That makes sense. Why else would you erase a person from history? Exodus chapter 2 and verses 5 through 7 says, "Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her female attendants working alongside the Nile. She saw a basket among the reeds. She sent a slave woman and brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw a child. Behold, the boy was crying, and she had pity on him. And she said, 'This is one of the Hebrew children.' Of course, then she adopts Moses, brings him in to her house, and she's the one that actually names him Moses. One more thing before we jump off of the Pharaohs, and that is, look at the name. Thutmose III. Moses, Hatshepsut, Thutmose III. You see a common thread. In fact, this dynasty of pharaohs under this is called the Thutmose dynasty because they had pharaohs named Amos, Thutmose, several pharaohs with that M-O-S-E name or root within their name, much like Moses. So if we accept that and we look at the evidence that that's showing us, Egyptian history, we can say, well, we have a time, we have a date, but now we need a place. We need a place to go looking and try to find evidence that the Israelites were in Egypt and that they left. Well, we can tell by Genesis chapter 47, we know exactly where they settled. It says, "Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Your father, your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen.'" Of Goshen. We know where Goshen was. When we look at archaeology and we dig in the dirt, we can find Goshen. Goshen was in what's Lower Egypt, which technically is northern Egypt, but in what is called Lower Egypt, in the delta of the Nile, we find the land of Goshen. We've got plenty of evidence for this. Not only that, we can find the city of Ramses. We can find where Ramses was. Now, interestingly enough, when we look at the city of Ramses, it's actually a city built on top of another city. The ancient city is Navaris, which is underneath Ramses. The top city, Ramses, there's really no archaeological evidence that the Israelites were there. There's nothing to point to and say that there was anybody but Egyptians living in the city of Ramses. When we dig down to the same time period that we're talking about, that the Bible tells us the Exodus happened, we look at the city of Avaris, not Ramses. The city of Avaris. Now, when we look at the city of Avaris, we find an amazing archaeological record. And in fact, we find a population of what they would call Semitic people, a population of people that are not Egyptians, that look like they descended from Syrian and the Canaanite region in Israelites. And we find this population came to Avaris around that same time period, and they came with a relatively low amount of people initially, probably about 70 to 100 people. They came under consent of the king, it appears, and over the span of a few generations, their population ballooned to over to several thousand over about 400 years. Matches exactly what we read in the Bible about the Israelites. When we look at Avaris, we also see that these people were shepherds, that they raised sheep, they raised goats, they raised cattle. We see that we even see that at one point they suddenly left this town. It seems like they lived there up until one particular day, and then the entire population left. Now, interestingly enough, when we look at the archaeological record, it also tells us that right before they left, there was a plague. There was a plague where people in Egypt were buried in mass graves. That's unusual because Egypt was very particular about their dead. They didn't like to bury people in mass graves. They would mummify an individual and preserve their body for the afterlife. When we look at the archaeological record of Avaris and of this time period, that's what we see. We see these mass graves where people were just thrown in haphazardly and buried. We see a population that grew to thousands of people in about 400 years. And we see a population that completely abandoned the city almost overnight. All these things are evident when we look at the biblical time period of when the Exodus happened. But let's go back to Joseph. Let's look at what we know about Joseph. We know that Joseph was given authority in Egypt. In Genesis chapter 41, verses 40 through 41, says, Pharaoh here tells him, you shall be in charge of my house, and all my people shall be obedient to you. Only regarding the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have placed you over all the land of Egypt. He was given a lot of authority. More authority than we can actually, when we look in the archaeological record of Egypt, this was actually the most authority we ever see a foreigner be given. Egypt liked to promote from within. They loved nepotism. They would promote Egyptians, not foreigners. But yet in the Bible we see a different record. We see Joseph being promoted from without. In Genesis chapter 37 and verse 3, we see that Joseph was given a multicolored coat, right? That's what we know him for. It says, Israel, his father, loved Joseph more than all his other sons because he was the son of his old age. He made him a multicolored tunic. In fact, it was this tunic that his brothers would dip in blood and bring back to his father. So we see that about Joseph. We also see that Joseph lived, when he got to Egypt, he lived as an Egyptian. He took on Egyptian customs. He immersed himself in the Egyptian culture. So much so that in Genesis chapter 42 and verse 8, when his brothers come to Egypt, they don't recognize him. It says Joseph recognized his brothers, although they didn't recognize him, because now he's looking and he's dressing and he's acting like an Egyptian. Interestingly enough, when we look at Avaris and we go down into that city and we look at the archaeological record, we find something really, really fascinating. So fascinating so that I think that if you look at this with any type of realistic expectations, you can't see anything but the house of Joseph and but archaeological evidence that the Bible's true. We find a palace here in Avaris that was built by Egyptians in the Egyptian style, but yet we see a person that lived in this palace from pottery fragments and different things. We see a person that was an Egyptian that lived there. A foreigner lived there. Some interesting things about this palace that was built. It's bigger than all the other houses around it. Within the portico of this palace, we see it supported by 12 columns, right? 12 sons, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 sons of Jacob. Behind this palace, we see graves, and we see 12 graves. One of those graves is actually built in an Egyptian style. It's a pyramid. Now that's interesting because the Egyptians, the only people that could be buried in pyramids during the time of the Egyptians were extremely high officials or Pharaoh himself. But we see a pyramid tomb, a small pyramid tomb built in the garden of this palace. Within that pyramid tomb, we see a statue. A statue of a foreigner, a man who wasn't an Egyptian, but yet this is a statue that was gifted to this person on his burial. This statue is about twice the size of a normal human being, meaning the Egyptians, as they built their statues bigger and bigger, that symbolized authority. So this was a person that had authority, that was well respected in the Egyptian community. This was a person that carried, in the statue, they carry a throw stick, a symbol of authority across their shoulder like this. He has a foreign haircut. And on the shoulder of that statue, we can see that this person was shrouded in a tunic of different colors. We also see that the face of this statue was deliberately chiseled off later on, and that statue was broken. Within that tomb, we can also see that the bones, before this happened, before the statue was demolished and the face was chiseled off, that the bones in that tomb were taken out and removed. You see, we find this amazing archaeological record if we only get out of the way and we look at what the Bible says and we look at the timeline of history. At Avaris, this ancient city, we find an important official who was not Egyptian, but yet was given Pharaoh's burial. We find that he was gifted a statue that was placed inside his pyramid tomb, which depicted him wearing a multicolored coat. His statue was later smashed and vandalized as if those people didn't like him anymore, didn't respect him, didn't hold him to any authority any longer, and had forgotten who he was. We find also before that happened that his bones were carefully removed from that tomb and were taken off, and we don't know where. We also see a foreign people who lived in this town whose population exploded over about 400 years and who suddenly left the ancient city after a plague struck that land. But what about the 10 plagues? Really quickly, what about the 10 plagues? Do we find any evidence in the historical record for the 10 plagues? Well, interestingly enough, we do. Now, I'm going to direct you to this page back here, the outline, if you want to read more on this, but we don't have time to go over much of it. We're going to hit a very small amount very quickly. Exodus chapter 10 and verse 7, it says, Then Pharaoh's servants said to him, they said to Pharaoh, How long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the people go so that they may serve the Lord God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is destroyed? So Pharaoh's own advisors were telling Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, right? Well, interestingly enough, we found a papyrus dated to this time period. It's called the Papyrus of Ipwar. And Ipwar was a scribe in Egypt, and Ipwar wrote, Behold, Egypt is fallen to the pouring of water. The river is blood. Those were the words of the scribe. In Genesis chapter 4 and verse 9, when God is telling Moses to go to Pharaoh, he says, If they don't believe these two signs, the leprosy, throwing his staff down to become a snake, if they don't believe that and they pay no attention to what you say, then take some water from the Nile, pour it on dry ground, and the water which you take from the Nile, it will turn into blood on dry ground. Here's a scribe that writes almost that exact thing. Behold, Egypt is fallen to the pouring of water. The river is blood. That same scribe would go on to write, Behold, plague sweeps the land. There's no shortage of death. And he makes several more comparisons to the 10 plagues. For time, that's all we got. I hope you've stayed with me for most of that, and I hope it's been fruitful, and I hope it's been interesting. But I want us to rewind really quickly as we close this lesson. And I want you to think about this. This lesson's not been one on how to become a Christian, but rather why. Why should we become a Christian? Because the Bible is true. Because when we look at archaeology, when we look at history, it tells us the exact thing the Bible tells us as well. What lesson can we gain from this? In Genesis chapter 45 and verses 4 through 5, Joseph said to his brothers, Don't be grieved, don't be angry with yourselves. You sold me here, but what? God sent me ahead of you to save lives. God put me in this place for a purpose. In Esther, it's a very similar sentiment to what Esther says in Esther chapter 4 and verse 14, when Mordecai says to Esther, For if you keep silent at this time, liberation and rescue will arise for the Jews from another place. You and your father's house will perish. Who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. I want you to think about that, for such a time as this. That simple statement. Again, this hasn't been a lesson on how to become a Christian, but rather why. Why should we? Because the Bible's true. Because what we see in the Bible, what we see mirrors history exactly. If you're here this morning and you've been struggling with your faith, or you've doubted your faith, or you've doubted, if you had that question, then maybe for such a time as this, you were in this audience and you heard this message, and maybe for such a time as this, you were convinced that the Bible is indeed true. I don't know, when I go all the way back to college, I don't know why I had that conversation with that gentleman named Barry, who was a practicing pagan. I have no idea why I decided to talk to him that night, why I decided to try and have a Bible study that time, because there were plenty of times in college where I would see people that I knew were doing wrong, and I didn't try to have a Bible study with him, but for some reason at that point I did. I don't know why. Maybe it was for such a time as this. You see, that's a powerful statement, for such a time as this. You think about that, God put us in place. He put us where we are. Whatever you're dealing with in life, whatever your struggles are, He put you there for a reason. For such a time as this. That's what history teaches us, that there's a time, there's a place for everything. That's also what the Bible teaches us. If you're here this morning and you need to respond to the invitation, then you might not have another time as this. We want to encourage you to come forward to be buried with Him in baptism if that's your need, or to make your life right in a public way. I want you to respond while together we stand and sing.